Okay, I'm back. Let's go over a couple sample responses to question number 1 on the 2014 exam. So this first one I'm going to show you comes from a student who earned all 10 points possible on this question. So they received 3 points for their graph. You'll notice they had plant population on the x-axis, trichomes per centimeter squared on the y-axis, so they had their units. They scaled it appropriately, and they showed their 95% confidence intervals right there. Now notice this student did not draw their bars in on this bar graph, which is kind of an unusual way to do it, but it's still technically correct to do it that way. I don't know if you could notice in the middle of each of these bars is a little dot that this student drew in, which implies where the mean is. So it's not the way I would draw a graph. I would like to make it a little bit more clear, but it was good enough for the College Board. Okay, so they got all 3 points for this. Now let's take a look, excuse me, at part B. I hope you can read that okay. This one is a little faint. Plant population 1 is most likely to have significant differences in mean stem trichome density to population 3 because the means as well as the standard error of the means do not overlap numerically. Okay, so that's where they got their 2 points there. They said they correctly identified that population 1 and 3 were the most different, and they said the standard error of the means do not overlap. Okay. Then they went on to say there's a difference of 1 between the highest limit of population 1 at 11 and the lowest of population 3 at 12. This means that data within those data set cannot equal each other, and I can't read the rest of this, but they got the full 2 points for that. So this student now has 5 points. Now let's take a look at part C. Now remember in part C they had to identify that independent variable, the dependent variable, the control. They had to say what would the duration of the experiment be and what kind of data would support the hypothesis that the presence of herbivores would select for plants with an increased stem trichome density. So in part C they wrote, in an experiment to test for whatever higher stem trichome density is selected for with the presence of herbivores, the independent variable would be exposure to herbivores. So there's the first point. The dependent variable would be the number of trichomes per centimeter squared. And a control would be a population of plants that is not exposed to herbivores. So in that one sentence, they've got 3 points. Boom. 1, 2, 3. The appropriate duration would be over several generations. So there's their 4th point. Let us say 7, which it didn't have to be 7, just as long as it's more than 1, so that the offspring of the generations begin to show the phenotype that is being selected for in a measurable percentage test that can be compared to the change of the control. This change will occur if natural selection, I can't read that, the frequency of phenotypes. I predict that the mean and standard error of the mean will be higher in the plant population that is exposed to herbivores than the population without exposure to herbivores. So this was the data that would support the hypothesis. So notice half the points available in this question came from the experimental design, which, it's not inconsistent with what the College Board's done before, I think, because designing and interpreting experiments is really important. So that's a 10. That's what you want to be shooting for. Now, here's another decent answer. This is a student who got a 6 instead of a 10. So let's take a look at that. So on their graph, for this graph, they only earned 2 points. Okay? They do have the axes labeled, but it looks to me like they didn't put the units here. So maybe they only got 1 point on this one. I'll have to look this up. This might be 1 because they did not put units. They did not put units on here. But they did use a bar graph, and they did correctly plot the means, but they did not have any error bars. No 95% confidence intervals, so they definitely lost a point there, and I don't see any units here. So part B, they only got 1 point in part B. The two populations that are most likely to have statistically significant differences in the mean trichome density are populations 1 and population 3. They got a point for that because they represent the smallest mean density and the largest mean density, respectively. That is a true statement, but if you go back to the question, they asked you to use the standard errors of the means to justify your choice of which two groups were the least alike, and this student did not do that. So they only got 1 point for that, and that was actually kind of a typical response to Part B that year. So let's take a look for what they wrote for their experiment. The independent variable for this experiment would be trichome density. The dependent variable would be the number of plants remaining after a period of time. So remember I showed you the two ways in the last video that you could design this experiment. So they did get a point for the independent variable. They did get a point for the dependent variable. The control would be a population of plants with no trichomes. Okay, there's a point for the control. The approximate duration of the experiment should be 2 years to ensure that natural selection is measured. And that sentence kind of makes me sad because it sounds like they were on the right track, but they didn't get quite specific enough. I mean, you and I know that 2 years is probably more than one generation, but what kind of plant are we talking about? Maybe a plant has a life cycle of more than 2 years. Some plants do. So it might not be more than one generation, and that's why they didn't get the point for that. I would predict the experimental results to show that there are more surviving after 2 years that have a higher trichome density and fewer that have low trichome density. Trichome density for this experiment would vary from 1 trichome to 20 trichomes. Oh, so they're just being a little bit more specific about what they would have their independent variables be. After a period of time during which they are all exposed to the same number and kinds of herbivores, still exposed to the same number and type of herbivores after the given time. So it looks to me like they got independent variable, dependent variable, control. They got a 4th point for identifying that 1 and 3 are the most different. Maybe they got a 5th point for recognizing it was supposed to be a bar graph, and maybe their 6th point was correctly plotting the means. But they didn't put units, they didn't do their 95% confidence intervals, and they didn't get the duration of the experiment had to be more than one generation. So, all right, I hope that helps. Bye.